The disposition parameter then is used to define both the status of the data set that we are working with, as well as the action, if any, that we want taken when we're done processing that data set. Basically what this amounts to then is that when we have a disposition parameter, we would code the status. And the status in this case of a disposition old, for example, or a disposition share, or a disposition mod, indicates that the data set already exists. It is not being defined. And as a result, we are referencing it as either an existing old data set, we are sharing it for read, or we are using a disposition mod which wants us to append data at the end of the existing data set. When we say disposition new, then we are creating a new data set, and then we will have other parameters that are required to specify space, device, and data set characteristics. The termination options allow us to determine what action we want to take for this data set once the job itself is completed. And so essentially what we're dealing with then is that when we start the job itself, the data set status is going to indicate how we can share that particular data set. So if it's opened with a new, old, or a mod, then that means that we have exclusive use of that data set and no one else can share that data set with us. If we say disposition share, then we are sharing that data set with anyone else that wants read access to that data set. And part of the reason for this, of course, is that it makes sense that if we are creating a new data set or if we are writing output to a data set, it doesn't make sense for us to share that with somebody else that may want to read that information because they wouldn't be picking up the current information that's being updated. The termination status, though, indicates what we want to do with that data set once the job step has terminated normally. Now the default action is that we are going to retain the status of that data set based on the status that it had when the job first started. So by default, what we are going to do is we are going to say if the data set did not exist previously, then we will automatically delete it when we're done in the absence of any other definition. If the data set did exist prior to that job starting, then we will retain that data set when the job ends. Those are going to be the default actions. The disposition default is new, delete, delete, indicating that we are assuming it's a new data set. We will delete it when we complete normally, or we will delete it when we complete abnormally. So as an example, in this case here, we are creating a new data set. We indicate we want to catalog it, which means we want to record the entry into the system's catalog, and in the event that the job abnormally terminates, we want to delete the data set. This is quite frequently done when we may need to rerun the job. That way, in the event of abnormal termination, we delete the data set, so when we rerun it, we're in a position to create it again and catalog the new version. Otherwise, if we had created the data set and simply kept it, when we rerun the job, we would have a JCL problem because we're attempting to create a data set now that already exists. The disposition share simply indicates that we are sharing this data set for anybody else that wants read access. Disposition of old delete. This indicates that we have a data set that currently exists, but when we get done processing, we want to delete the data set. And so in this case here, again, we may very well have a data set that we've created in a job someplace else, and now that we're processing it, when we get done, we want to simply get rid of it. And this could occur if we had a sequence of jobs that we were running where we might create a data set in the very beginning, and then several jobs later, after we're done using it and producing reports or whatever else we want to do, we simply get rid of it now. So the next time we go through the sequence, we can create a new data set again, and then go through these steps and these jobs again in order to process the information. Disposition of mod indicates that we want to append data at the end of the current data set, and this would be used anytime that we have a data set where we want to periodically add information to what's already there. That way we don't have to read the entire file and copy it and then add new information. Opening it with the disposition of mod will automatically place us at the end of the file and allow us to append data to an existing file. So the basic considerations for disposition processing, as we said, is that the default action is to return the data set to the same status it was in before the job started. If it existed, we're going to keep it. If it didn't exist, we're going to delete it. And so as a result, what we end up with then is that we end up with the idea that the disposition processing for normal termination and abnormal termination says, is there anything that we want to do that's different from that default action? For example, if I'm creating a new data set and I want to keep that data set, then I need to specify the option that says I want to keep it rather than letting it delete by default. Similarly, if it's an existing data set and I want to get rid of it, then I would need to specify delete, since the default action would be to keep it, since it was already an existing data set when the job started. Now, abnormal termination in this case here means that if the job itself terminates abruptly with an abend code. This does not mean that we have a bad return code or anything else. A normal completion means that the job ran to end, whether it had errors or not. An abnormal termination means that the job was not capable of completing and the system terminated that job. As a result, the action to be taken in the disposition will be determined by whether it was a normal termination or an abnormal termination. If we do not code an explicit action for abnormal termination, then the option we have for the normal is what will be used. If the parameters that we are using have not been specified, since they are positional, then we must account for their absence with a comma. In most cases, you're not going to really see this used very frequently. The most common, of course, being that since new is the default, you will very often see a disposition coded of comma, catalog, comma, delete, indicating that the new has been eliminated. But for the most part, that's going to be the primary use that you will see of that kind of coding with respect to the positional parameters. The unit parameter is another parameter that is used. Now, most of the options here we are not going to discuss simply because of the fact that they represent a variety of different ways of addressing a device and managing the devices. This is something that you're really going to have to kind of come to terms with based on your installation standards and what the installation has installed as far as usage goes. Our primary purpose is going to be to use this to identify either a tape drive or a disk drive as the receiving device. And as a result, we are going to have some generic names that we can use so that we don't have to know device numbers or anything more explicit than that. And then the system can determine which specific device our data set will go to. So in the case of generic names, normally what will happen is that the system programmer will have defined something like sysda to represent all disk devices. Sysallda is another one that is often used, and then tape to indicate that we are using a tape device. All we would code in those instances then is unit equals sysda or unit equals tape. And that gives us a generic access to all of the devices of that particular type. We do not have to worry about specifying a specific location, since storage administration policies and installation standards will govern where the data sets can be allocated. So as a coder of JCL, we do not have to concern ourselves with where specifically something gets located.